On a night in 1954, beneath the chandeliers of the Academy Awards, the hall swelled with applause as a young woman walked forward to receive her golden statue. Her eyes, wide and uncertain, shimmered as though she had stepped into a dream not quite her own. The audience saw only radiance, but behind that smile were shadows already etched upon her heart. This is the story of Audrey Hepburn, an angelic figure adored for her elegance, but also a soul who bore secrets, losses, and longings that time has never fully unveiled. Dearest listener, before we step into this journey across memory and silence, I invite you to join me as a fellow traveler. Tell me, if you will, in the comments below, where you listen and in what quiet hour of your day or night. In this way, we become part of a vast circle of memory, stretching across oceans and generations. And if these stories touch you, press the subscribe button so that together we may keep alive the flame of timeless history. Now let us begin. She was born in 1929 in Brussels, a city of stone facades and gentle canals. Her mother, a baroness, carried with her the pride of old Dutch nobility. Her father, a banker, carried with him restlessness, ambition, and ultimately, the cruel ability to abandon. Audrey was still a child when he walked away, leaving a wound she would never quite close. Yet in those earliest years, she wandered gardens in Arnhem, a small Dutch town where lilac and tulip bowed in the spring, and the sky seemed wide enough to protect even the tenderest of hearts. There was laughter then, and a piano's gentle notes drifting from parlors, and the sound of a girl's slippered feet skipping across gravel paths. But history was stirring, dark and heavy like clouds that gather unseen at the horizon. Europe trembled, though children still played. Audrey's days were filled with dance lessons, and she held close to her dream of becoming a ballerina. She moved her arms as though they were wings. She turned and leapt in tiny halls, and her mother would watch with admiration, perhaps already imagining the triumphs her daughter might one day achieve. Yet every soft step was shadowed by the growing march of forces that even the innocence of youth could not banish. In Arnhem, the seasons were tender, and the river reflected skies of endless gray and sudden brightness. But by 1940, the silence of that land was broken. German planes growled overhead, and the occupation spread like frost across the soil. For Audrey, still a girl, the world turned overnight from a playground of dreams to a prison of fear. The lessons of ballet did not stop at once. She continued to stretch, to twirl, to believe that the art of beauty could survive even amid hunger and ruin. Yet each plie was marked by hunger pangs, each performance in small clandestine gatherings a quiet act of defiance against despair. It is said that she carried messages folded into her shoes, that she became a silent helper in the Dutch resistance. One imagines her slipping through shadowed streets, her eyes downcast, her steps hurried. She was only a child, yet the cloak of war made everyone older. Food grew scarce. In the hunger winter of 1944, she and so many others ate tulip bulbs to stay alive, chewed on bread made of sawdust, drank water thin and cold. Her once strong legs, shaped for dance, grew thin, weakened, forever altered. Malnutrition carved itself into her body, shaping the frailty that would haunt her throughout her life. In those dark days, she still danced, quietly, secretly, sometimes to raise money for the resistance. Imagine her, a girl lit by the glow of candles in a room where windows were shuttered, her body moving not only for art but for survival. The audience, hungry and frightened, watched in silence. Perhaps for a moment they forgot the boots outside, the arrests, the hunger gnawing within them. For a moment there was only the grace of a young girl's dance. Was it not a kind of prayer? A fragile offering to keep the spirit alive in times when the body faltered? Her father's absence weighed heavily, and throughout her life she sought in others the father she had lost. Some say this hunger for protection, for a safe harbor, drew her into romances both tender and destructive. But as a child, she had only her mother, strict yet devoted, who instilled in her discipline and the need to hold her head high no matter the ruin around them. Later, Audrey would often speak of her wartime years with quiet understatement, never indulging in bitterness, but always carrying the mark of one who had lived through both cruelty and grace. When the war finally ended, liberation came like sunlight after years of storm. Yet it was not joy alone that filled the streets. It was exhaustion, grief, and the silent tally of lives lost. Audrey, thin and pale, looked at the faces around her, and something within her shifted. She had survived, but the war had stolen her childhood, her strength, and perhaps even the certainty of ever truly belonging to the ordinary world. Still, she clung to her dream of dance. She left for Amsterdam, then London, to study ballet. But her body, weakened by malnutrition, could not sustain the rigors of a ballerina's life. Every tendu, every arabesque was a reminder of what war had taken from her. In the mirror, she saw the lines of a dancer, but her muscles trembled, her endurance faltered. Teachers admired her grace, but knew she would never be a star in the great ballet halls of Europe. And so, with the quiet resignation of one accustomed to loss, she turned her face toward another path. In this moment, can we not see how fate weaves its threads from both tragedy and gift? Had her body been stronger, perhaps she would have been a dancer known only in narrow circles. Instead, her fragile health pushed her toward another art, film, modeling, and acting, where her ethereal presence would one day captivate the world. Out of hunger and sorrow, a different kind of beauty was born. Yet did she ever stop mourning the dancer she might have been? One imagines her sitting by a window in London, a pair of worn ballet slippers resting beside her, the sound of traffic rising from the streets below. She holds them in her hands, soft leather molded by the shape of her feet, and wonders if they will ever again carry her to the dreams she once believed in. Outside, life presses forward, indifferent. Inside, a young woman leans into the silence, caught between the ruin of her past and the uncertain promise of what lies ahead. And so ends the first chapter of her life, with a girl staring at her shoes by a window, the ghost of music in her ears, the war still heavy upon her, and the future quietly waiting to be claimed. The ballet slippers by the window seem to whisper of what might have been, their softened leather carrying the imprint of a dream too fragile to survive the weight of war. From that quiet chamber, we move again into the world outside, where the memories of hunger and fear had not yet loosened their hold. For Audrey, adolescence was not marked by frivolous dances at summer festivals or the unfolding of carefree romances. It was marked instead by the memory of tulip bulbs boiled into bitter meals, the ache of hunger that gnawed day and night, and the echo of soldiers' boots reverberating through narrow streets. These memories did not fade when the war ended. They clung to her like a shadow, shaping her body and soul alike. In the winter of 1944, when the rivers froze and transport collapsed, the people of the Netherlands were left starving. The famine came not like a sudden storm, but like a steady suffocation. Trains no longer brought food, and cities grew silent except for the muffled cries of children. Audrey, her frame already slender, grew almost translucent in her thinness. She lost weight until her legs, once strong for dancing, were no more than fragile reeds. She became ill, weakened by jaundice and anemia, yet still she endured. She was one among many, and her story was repeated in countless houses. Yet in later years, when asked about those times, she would rarely linger. She spoke quietly, with restraint, as though the full truth was too heavy for words. It is said that during those dark months she carried messages for the resistance, folded into the soles of her shoes or tucked into her clothing. The risk was unimaginable. A child caught in such acts would have been punished with cruelty beyond measure. But what choice did they have? Even the youngest became part of survival's secret theater. And so we picture her walking along cobblestones, head bowed, her shoes tapping softly, heart racing as soldiers stood at corners. She was only a girl, yet she walked with the gravity of one much older. Could she have imagined then that one day the world would see her face not in shadows, but lit by the radiance of cinema? Or did she carry only the weight of the present? Her thoughts narrowed to the next step, the next corner, the next moment of silence. She sometimes performed small dances for gatherings hidden from the occupier's eyes. These performances were not for fame, nor for applause, but for survival. The coins collected went to the resistance, to those who risked everything. Imagine the scene. A room dimly lit by candles, the air heavy with fear, the windows shuttered against prying eyes. A young girl, thin yet graceful, moves across the floor, her arms reaching out as though to touch something beyond the room's suffocating walls. For a few minutes her dance lifted spirits above the hunger, above the fear. Perhaps it even gave them hope that beauty could still exist, however fleetingly, in a world of ruin. And yet the cost was heavy. Her body bore the scars. Years later, when she wished to pursue the path of the ballerina, she was told gently but firmly that her frame could not withstand the demands. She had the grace, the discipline, the spirit, but not the strength. Malnutrition had etched itself into her bones. How cruel it must have felt to have survived war only to find that it had stolen her dream. She had danced for freedom, but freedom took away the future of her dance. Her mother guided her through these years with strictness and resilience. The Baroness, though stern, gave her daughter the will to endure. Nobility meant little in the shadow of occupation, yet it instilled in Audrey a posture, a way of carrying herself that would one day become her hallmark. The elegance the world adored was born not of fashion, but of survival, a way of holding herself upright no matter what the world pressed upon her shoulders. When liberation came, it was not only soldiers and flags that entered the streets, but relief workers who brought food and medicine. Among them were representatives of an organization that would, decades later, become the cause to which Audrey devoted the last years of her life, UNICEF. She received milk, care, and aid in those days, and though she was too young to grasp the larger meaning, the impression remained. The kindness of strangers during her most vulnerable time etched itself into her soul, and when she was older, she would remember, and she would repay. The years immediately after the war were years of rebuilding. Cities cleared their rubble, families mourned their losses, and children stepped into the uncertain dawn of peace. For Audrey, this dawn meant a return to study. She traveled to Amsterdam and later to London, determined to pursue ballet despite her body's limitations. There, she trained under the great teachers of the time, her movements admired for their delicacy and expressiveness. Yet again and again the truth returned. Her strength was not enough. Each class ended with exhaustion, each rehearsal a reminder that her dream had been compromised long before she ever set foot in the studio. She did not surrender to bitterness. Instead, she allowed life to guide her down another path. She began to take small roles in theater, in chorus lines, even modeling to support herself. There was no grand ambition in these first steps, only the necessity of survival and the quiet hope that some form of art might still be hers. Yet those who saw her, even in minor parts, were struck by her presence. There was something about her, a stillness and radiance that seemed to belong not only to the stage, but to the gaze of history itself. In reflecting on these years, one cannot help but wonder, was it the war that gave her that quality, that sense of depth behind the eyes, that haunting mix of fragility and resilience? Many beautiful women grace the stage and screen, but few carried with them the weight of having truly suffered, truly endured. In Audrey, the world would one day see both light and shadow, innocence and sorrow intertwined. Perhaps it was born here, in the hunger and silence of occupied Europe. And so she moved forward, carrying with her the ghosts of the hunger winter, the lost dream of ballet, and the discipline of her mother's stern guidance. The world was opening, and though she did not yet know it, her face and her presence would soon capture hearts far beyond the narrow streets where soldiers once stood. But before fame, there was always the shadow of war. Before elegance, there was always hunger. These two truths lived within her, inseparable, like two voices in the same song. The slippers by the window remained, symbols of what had been lost. And outside that window, in the streets of post-war Europe, the world stirred with new beginnings, uncertain yet insistent. The girl who had once danced in candle-lit rooms now looked toward stages larger than she could imagine. Yet always, in the silence between steps, she heard again the echo of boots on cobblestones, fading but never gone. The echo of boots on cobblestones faded into silence, yet the worn ballet slippers by the window remained, reminders of a dream set aside but not entirely relinquished. Audrey carried them with her, sometimes in spirit, sometimes literally, as if they were relics of a past self that continued to whisper in the quiet moments between rehearsals and auditions. Though she would never again leap across grand stages as a prima ballerina, she stepped cautiously into another realm where movement, grace, and presence were still her gifts. That realm was the world of performance, first on small stages, then in front of the camera's unblinking eye. London after the war was a place of austerity and resilience. Rations still lingered. The buildings bore scars of bombardment, and the people, though weary, carried themselves with determination. It was here that Audrey studied, hoping her body might still grant her some portion of her dream. She enrolled at the Ballet Rambert School, one of the great centers of dance instruction, and her teachers admired her artistry. Yet even they, with kindness, reminded her of the truth. She could dance beautifully, but her strength was forever compromised. She would never be able to withstand the grueling hours, the punishing demands that defined a ballerina's career. What must it have felt like to hear this truth spoken aloud? A life's dream dissolving not because of lack of will or talent, but because history itself had etched frailty into her body. She did not weep in public. She rarely did. Instead, she absorbed the sorrow quietly, as she always had, and turned her face toward another horizon. If she could not be a dancer, perhaps she could still find a way to live through performance, through the embodiment of something larger than herself. To support her studies, she began modeling. Her long frame and delicate features made her stand out in a world accustomed to more conventional forms of beauty. She was not voluptuous, nor commanding in presence, yet there was something ethereal in the way she carried herself, as if a candle's glow lingered around her. Photographers found themselves drawn not only to her face, but to her eyes, which seemed to hold stories untold, and so her image began to appear in small magazines, in advertisements, in spaces where the world caught its first glimpse of the figure who would later captivate millions. From modeling came small roles in theater. She joined chorus lines, danced in revues, spoke brief lines in plays that passed quickly from memory. But each time, even when her part was minor, she carried within her that peculiar quality of being unforgettable. Audiences, though they might not recall the details of the production, remembered the presence of a slender young woman who seemed to belong not fully to the stage, nor to the world beyond it, but somewhere between. Her transition to film was gradual, almost hesitant. She appeared in small parts, often uncredited, walking across scenes with a basket in her hand or speaking a single line before disappearing. In Dutch in 7 Lessons, she was barely noticed, yet it was her first step into cinema. Later, she took on bit parts in films made in England, roles too small to predict what was to come. Yet directors noticed her stillness, her ability to command attention without effort. In a world where actresses often performed with grand gestures and overt charm, Audrey's presence was understated, almost fragile, and precisely for this reason it became magnetic. Was it fate that guided her into this path, or merely necessity? If she had been strong enough for ballet, perhaps she would have spent her life in shadowed studios, known only to those who loved the art. Instead, the weakness in her body became the doorway to another destiny. Out of suffering emerged a different kind of grace, one that could not be rehearsed or crafted but only lived. The late 1940s and early 1950s were years of struggle. She traveled often, balancing lessons, auditions, and the uncertainty of a career that offered little promise. Yet in these very years, the fragments of her identity began to weave together. She was the child who had endured war, the dancer whose body betrayed her, the model who carried herself like nobility, and the actress who seemed to speak even when silent. These layers gave her a depth rare in one so young. It was during this time that she was chosen for a small part in the French film Monte Carlo Baby. The role was minor, the production light, but it placed her in the company of artists who recognized her uniqueness. Among them was the novelist Colette, who upon seeing her declared that she had found her Gigi, the character she had long sought to bring to the stage. Colette's recognition was not based on fame, for Audrey had none. It was based on instinct, on the knowledge that this young woman carried within her the spirit of a character who was at once innocent and worldly, fragile and resilient. To be chosen by Colette was no small thing. It was as though literature itself had opened a door into the theater. Audrey was cast in the Broadway production of Gigi, and though she had little experience, she carried the role with a freshness that captivated audiences. Night after night, she walked onto the stage with wide eyes and luminous presence, embodying a character who mirrored in many ways her own contradictions. The success of Gigi marked a turning point, and the ballet slippers by the window began to fade into the background, replaced now by scripts, costumes, and the strange alchemy of the stage. Yet even as her career began to stir, she remained haunted by the fragility of her body. She ate carefully, aware that her frame could not afford indulgence. She exercised discipline in rest, in posture, in all the ways she carried herself. To the world she appeared naturally graceful, but in truth it was a discipline forged in war and loss. Her elegance was never an accident. It was survival turned into art. And so the girl who once danced in candle-lit rooms now stood on stages lit by Broadway's glow. The world had not yet named her a star, but it had begun to notice. And behind every glance, every quiet smile, there lingered the shadow of hunger, the memory of boots on cobblestones, the knowledge that beauty and sorrow can dwell in the same body. As the applause for Gigi echoed, and as the curtain fell each night, she would return to her dressing room, remove her costume, and sit for a moment in silence. One wonders what she thought in those pauses. Did she remember the hunger years? Did she still feel the ghost of ballet slippers pressed against her feet? Or did she simply close her eyes and allow herself, for the first time, to believe that perhaps she had found her place in the world? The slippers by the window were still there, though fading into memory, their presence no longer a burden, but a reminder of a path that had led her, by sorrow and chance, into another destiny. And outside, the sound was no longer of boots, but of applause, mingling with the hum of a world that had at last begun to notice her light. The applause from Gigi lingered like an echo long after the curtain had fallen, carrying her from the narrow streets of Broadway into a broader horizon. In that echo was the promise of something larger, though she herself could not yet see its full shape. Night after night she had stepped onto the stage, slender and luminous, and each evening audiences had felt the same quiet pull. It was not simply performance, it was presence, the kind of presence that cannot be taught, born instead from the weaving together of fragility and endurance. The theater had embraced her, but it was the unblinking eye of the camera that was waiting to claim her next. Cinema, with its power to magnify every gesture, to linger on every pause, was perhaps always destined to be her realm. On stage, she was admired, but the vastness of Broadway's lights could not capture the subtleties of her expression. In film, even the smallest tilt of her head, the flicker of hesitation in her eyes, could speak volumes. She began with small appearances, often barely noticed, yet each role carried her closer to recognition. The camera, indifferent to many, seemed to hold a particular tenderness toward her, as though it had found in her features the perfect mirror for vulnerability. During this time, she appeared in British films, taking on small roles that demanded little but offered much. She walked through scenes like a figure glimpsed in passing, yet audiences remembered her. The directors, too, saw something unusual. Here was a young woman who did not need to demand attention, for it was given to her effortlessly. In her silence, she spoke. In her stillness, she moved. That rare paradox set her apart from others who strove more visibly. One of these small roles took her to the south of France, where she filmed Monte Carlo Baby. The story was light, the film hardly remembered, yet fate placed her there in the path of those who would guide her next steps. The novelist Colette, passing through, saw her on set and declared that she had found the living embodiment of her Gigi. Thus Broadway had opened its arms to her, and from that doorway cinema took notice. The world was beginning to lean closer. With Gigi concluded and her presence noted in film, doors began to open. She was cast in small supporting roles, her name appearing in credits, her face lingering in scenes just long enough to intrigue. Yet her breakthrough had not yet come. She was still a figure hovering at the threshold, a promise rather than a certainty. She lived in small apartments, studied diligently, moved carefully between auditions and rehearsals. To those around her, she seemed both ordinary and extraordinary, a young woman balancing budgets and meals, yet carrying herself with the elegance of someone who seemed always just beyond reach. The world of fashion began to notice her as well. Designers admired her frame, slender and elongated, so unlike the voluptuous ideals of the time. Hubert de Givenchy, though he had not yet fully entered her life, would soon recognize in her the muse who would define his creations. But even before that partnership, photographers and stylists saw her as something new, something modern. Her image began to appear more often, her presence no longer confined to the stage or to uncredited film roles, but entering the public imagination. And yet fame had not yet descended. In this in-between time, she walked unnoticed through many streets, her face known only to a few, her name whispered in limited circles. Did she sense what was approaching? Did she feel the horizon shifting, the wind carrying her toward a destiny she had not sought? Or was she still the girl by the window, holding ballet slippers in her memory, unsure of what future awaited? Her life in these years was marked by discipline, the kind instilled by her mother and deepened by war. She worked tirelessly, studied constantly, maintained a posture of quiet determination. She was never careless with opportunity, never indulgent with her time. Those who knew her spoke of her humility, her willingness to learn, her absence of vanity. And yet vanity was unnecessary. The world was beginning to see her as the embodiment of grace. The pivotal moment came when she was cast in a role that would at last draw the world's gaze, Roman Holiday. the story of a princess escaping her gilded cage, wandering freely through the streets of Rome, mirrored in many ways her own desire to step out of constraint into freedom. 2. She had not yet filmed it, but the path was opening, and the weight of possibility grew heavier each day. The cameras, the scripts, the directors, they were aligning around her, preparing to capture the light she carried. Still, before that defining leap, there was the quieter, gentler rise through minor roles, each one a stepping stone. And it is in these steps that one sees her character most clearly. She did not burst suddenly into fame. She arrived gradually, with patience, carrying within her the discipline of a dancer, the endurance of a survivor. Fame, when it came, would appear sudden to the world, but to her it was the result of years of quiet labor, of small parts played with sincerity, of nights spent studying lines in dim apartments. One imagines her in those years, returning home after rehearsals, sitting at a small table with a lamp casting its light over worn pages of a script. Outside, the streets of London or Paris hummed with life, but inside she read quietly, her voice murmuring lines to the silence. Did she know then that the camera would soon capture her, not in fragments but in fullness? Or did she simply prepare for each day as it came, as she always had, one step at a time? The applause of Gigi had faded, but it lingered within her as a memory of what could be. The film sets, though modest, gave her glimpses of what might unfold, and so she moved forward, slowly, gracefully, carrying the weight of fragility and the gift of presence. The slippers by the window had been left behind, but in their place were scripts and costumes, the tools of a new art that would soon claim her entirely. And as the lights dimmed after another small performance, as the camera packed away after another brief scene, the air held a sense of something unfinished, something waiting. The applause was no longer enough. The silence itself seemed to lean forward, anticipating. The stage had carried her this far, but it was the camera's gaze that was ready to open a new door, a door through which the world would soon follow her. The silence that leaned forward, expectant after the fading applause of Gigi and the last camera shutter of a modest film roll, was broken by the call of destiny that bore her toward Rome. It was there, among ancient stones and sunlit piazzas, that the door opened and the world stepped through it with her. The film was Roman Holiday, and though at first she was considered too untested, too unknown to carry such a role, the director William Wyler saw in her what others were only beginning to perceive, that rare mixture of innocence and depth, of lightness and shadow. He placed upon her shoulders the weight of a story that would live beyond its time, and she, though trembling within, bore it with luminous grace. The role was of a princess, bound by duty yet longing for freedom, slipping into the city in disguise to taste the life denied her. How fitting it was that Audrey, who had lived under the gaze of war, of hunger, of discipline, should now play a woman stepping out of confinement into sudden liberty. When she rode through Rome on a scooter, her hair caught in the wind, or when she gazed at Gregory Peck with wide, uncertain eyes, the audience saw not only a character, but something of her true self, a soul caught between duty and desire, fragility and strength. The camera adored her. It lingered on her face, capturing every fleeting nuance as though reluctant to let go. She did not need to perform in grand gestures. A single glance conveyed longing, a faint smile conveyed freedom, and silence itself became eloquent. Audiences across the world felt they had discovered not just an actress, but a presence, someone who seemed to embody their own yearning for beauty and purity in a world still scarred by war. When the film was released in 1953, the effect was immediate. Critics marveled at her freshness, her authenticity. The Academy, in its judgment, placed into her hands the Golden Statue for Best Actress, an honor she accepted with trembling humility. She was still so young, still so new, yet already she had been crowned. The moment when she stood under the chandeliers of the Academy, clutching the award to her chest, was the moment the world sealed her as a star. But as she smiled into the lights, did she not feel the weight of something larger than joy? For recognition, though sweet, carries its own chains, and fame, once given, cannot easily be set down again. With Roman Holiday, she became a symbol of a new kind of femininity. The world had grown accustomed to screen sirens of bold glamour, women who commanded attention with sensuality and fire. Audrey was different. She was slender, understated, delicate, her beauty more in suggestion than in display. She wore simple dresses, her hair cropped short, her movements unforced. This simplicity became her signature, and in it many found a refreshing truth. She was not a goddess beyond reach, but a woman whose fragility made her seem near. And yet, paradoxically, her very nearness made her untouchable. The success of the film brought with it an avalanche of offers. Hollywood, eager to claim her, extended contracts and roles, and suddenly she was no longer the young woman studying scripts in a dim apartment, but an icon whose image was printed in magazines across the world. Her life shifted overnight from anonymity to adoration. Fans followed her in the streets, photographers sought her smile, and directors spoke her name in admiration. Yet beneath the glitter of sudden fame, she remained the same Audrey, disciplined, reserved, quietly carrying her past within her. There was joy, yes, in this transformation, but also unease. She had never sought such glory. She had longed for dance, for art, for quiet expression. Fame, with its relentless gaze, threatened to strip her of the privacy she so deeply valued. In interviews, she spoke with humility, downplaying her gifts, attributing her success to luck. She accepted praise with grace, but never seemed fully at ease in the role of star. Perhaps because she knew that the public saw only light while she still carried shadows. Rome itself became part of her memory, its fountains and plazas forever tied to the film that crowned her. She would return to the city later in life, walking quietly through the same streets, unnoticed by many, yet always carrying within her the echo of that holiday, that brief interlude when fiction and reality seemed to blend. For the princess who escaped her palace was not entirely unlike the young woman who escaped the shadows of war, stepping at last into the sunlight of recognition. And yet, as her name rose to international acclaim, she faced a new burden, the pressure to sustain such perfection. Could she, fragile as she was, continue to meet the world's insatiable hunger for her image, her presence, her grace? Or would the very light that now embraced her become too heavy to bear? In her eyes at the Academy, shimmering under the chandeliers, one might already glimpse the quiet sorrow of a woman who knew that every crown carries its own shadow. The applause from Broadway had been sweet but brief. The applause from Rome was unending, echoing across oceans, resounding in every cinema where her face flickered across the screen. She was no longer a girl at a window with ballet slippers. She was the world's Audrey Hepburn, the angel of innocence, the embodiment of elegance. Yet even as she stood in that light, she must have felt again the faint hunger of her youth, the echo of boots on cobblestones, the knowledge that beauty is always born from sorrow as much as from joy. And so the curtain closed on her anonymity and opened on her legend. The world had embraced her, crowned her, claimed her. But as she stepped from Rome into Hollywood's embrace, the story was only beginning, and already the seeds of both triumph and tragedy were being sown in the soil of her new life. The golden statue from Roman Holiday gleamed in her hands, and the applause that had carried her through Rome still lingered, like a song that refused to end. Yet even as she stood crowned with sudden glory, another transformation was already taking shape. one that would not only define her career, but alter the very language of fashion and cinema. For in the wake of her triumph, Hollywood sought to shape her into its familiar mold, but Audrey remained different, elusive, untamed by the traditions of glamour. The next great turning of her life came with Sabrina, a tale of longing, transformation, and identity, in which she herself would be transformed into an icon beyond film. The story was simple. The daughter of a chauffeur who returns from Paris changed, stepping into the world of wealth and love with new poise. Yet within that simplicity lay a mirror for Audrey herself, for she too was stepping into a new realm, crossing the threshold between anonymity and legend. The young woman who had once worn plain clothes in wartime Europe now found herself draped in silks, her frame carrying designs that would redefine elegance. It was in Sabrina that she first worked with Hubert de Givenchy, though their meeting was not born of grand intention but of a misunderstanding. She had sought out his atelier, hoping to borrow dresses, and he, expecting another Hepburn, Catherine, was surprised to find instead a slender young woman with wide eyes and an accent still touched by Europe. Yet in that meeting, something unspoken passed between them. He saw in her not just a body for his designs, but a spirit that could give them life. She, in turn, found in him a kindred soul, someone who clothed not only her figure, but her essence. Their collaboration was to become one of the most enduring partnerships between actress and designer in history. The costumes he created for her in Sabrina, the black cocktail dress, the flowing white gown, the simple yet daring cuts, were not merely clothes. They were extensions of her very being. When she wore them on screen, it was as though she and the fabric became inseparable, each amplifying the other's beauty. Audiences were enchanted, critics spoke of a new standard, and women across the world sought to imitate her style. But imitation was impossible, for what they sought was not merely fashion but the aura she carried, the blend of vulnerability and dignity that no dress alone could bestow. It was here, in the shimmering frame of Sabrina, that she became not only an actress but an icon of style. The world began to speak of her in the same breath as elegance itself. Her short hair, her delicate brows, her slender frame, all of it broke from the Hollywood tradition of voluptuous glamour. She was something new, something modern, and the world embraced it eagerly. Givenchy's designs became synonymous with her name, and together they reshaped the landscape of beauty. Yet beneath the silks and the lights, Audrey remained a woman still haunted by her past, still cautious in her joy. She carried herself with ease, but that ease was born of discipline. She smiled, but her eyes always seemed to hold something withheld, a memory not to be shared. In interviews, she spoke lightly of her success, insisting always that she was lucky, that she was unworthy of such acclaim. One might sense that she feared the fragile glass of her new life could shatter at any moment. Perhaps it was because she knew that beauty and fame, like applause, are fleeting, and that the silence which follows is often heavier than the sound itself. The set of Sabrina was not without tension. Humphrey Bogart, seasoned and weary, regarded her youth and inexperience with skepticism. William Holden, charming and unpredictable, drew her into an affair that whispered of both passion and peril. She was still young, still seeking, still vulnerable to the allure of love. In these entanglements, we glimpse again the echo of her father's absence, the hunger for protection and tenderness that she sought in men who were often incapable of giving it. Her life off-screen mirrored in troubling ways the very story she played on screen, a young woman navigating between worlds, between love and longing, between illusion and truth. The success of Sabrina was immense. It confirmed what Roman Holiday had suggested. Audrey was not a fleeting star, but a presence that would endure. She had now conquered both the heart of Hollywood and the world of fashion, her image fixed in the public imagination as the embodiment of modern grace. Photographers pursued her, magazines crowned her the face of a new era, and women altered their wardrobes in imitation. She had become not just an actress, but a symbol. Yet symbols, for all their radiance, often suffer in silence. To be elevated as the icon of elegance is to be bound by it, to be expected always to embody what others project. Did she, in her quiet moments, long to step away from the silks and lights to return to the anonymity of ordinary life? Did she tire of being seen as perfect when within she carried scars of hunger, loss, and longing? These questions cannot be answered, only imagined, as we picture her at night. The gowns folded away, her face bare of makeup, her hands resting quietly in her lap as she sits by a window and gazes into the dark. The sound of applause had carried her from Rome to Paris to Hollywood, and now the rustle of silk carried her further still, into the realm of legend. Yet even in that rustle, if one listened closely, one might still hear the faint echo of boots on cobblestones, the whisper of hunger in a child's stomach, the dream of ballet shoes never worn again. She was no longer the girl who danced in candlelit rooms, but that girl remained within her, shaping every step she now took on stages of far greater brilliance. The image left unresolved at the close of Sabrina is not the applause nor the glamour, but the sound of fabric against skin, the hush of silk gowns in a quiet dressing room. There, in the silence between takes, between roles, between dreams, we glimpse her most truly, an angel cloaked in elegance, yet always carrying within her the fragile weight of her hidden sorrows. The hush of silk in the dressing room lingered, faint as the memory of a sigh, as though the gowns themselves remembered the weight of her presence. Yet soon, silk would give way to pearls, and the intimate quiet of Sabrina would open onto the glittering facade of Fifth Avenue. It was there, before the wide windows of Tiffany's, that Audrey's image would be sealed into eternity, her silhouette draped in black, her eyes shaded by dark glasses, a paper cup of coffee in hand. Breakfast at Tiffany's was not simply a film, it was an act of myth-making, the creation of an icon whose image would remain long after her voice had faded from the screen. The character of Holly Golightly was unlike the innocent princess of Roman Holiday or the chauffeur's daughter of Sabrina. Holly was a woman of contradictions, at once worldly and naive, light-hearted and deeply wounded. She floated through the city with laughter and charm, yet beneath her gaiety lay loneliness and fragility. In embodying Holly, Audrey revealed another side of herself, one that resonated with her own inner tensions. The longing to belong, the fear of captivity, the dream of freedom that never seemed fully within reach. The opening scene, where she steps from a taxi in the dawn light and gazes into the windows of Tiffany's while nibbling at her pastry, became more than cinema. It became a language of elegance recognized worldwide. The black Givenchy gown, the pearls coiled at her neck, the oversized sunglasses, all combined to craft an image that no passage of time has dimmed. But what made the moment endure was not the costume alone. It was the way Audrey moved within it, the way she carried the hunger in her eyes, the faint wistfulness in her posture. She was dressed as though for perfection, yet her soul seemed just slightly apart, as though she were a stranger in her own legend. The role was not without controversy. Truman Capote, who had created Holly in his novella, had imagined a different kind of actress, someone less refined, more provocative. He doubted whether Audrey, with her delicacy, could capture the rawness of his creation. Yet once again, she defied expectation. She did not play Holly as Capote wrote her. She played Holly as a dream, a fragile figure caught between reality and fantasy. The world embraced this interpretation, even if it was gentler, less scandalous. In her hands, Holly became not a reckless woman of the night, but a symbol of longing, an angel who wandered city streets searching for something unnamed. And yet, for Audrey, the role carried its own shadow. To embody Holly was to embody emptiness disguised as charm, loneliness dressed in pearls. In many ways, it mirrored her own life, for even in the midst of fame, she often confessed to feelings of solitude, to the sense that she was never fully at home in the world. Was it this shared essence that allowed her to inhabit Holly so convincingly? Or did playing Holly deepen her own awareness of the hollowness fame could not fill? The production itself carried its share of tension. Filming on New York streets drew crowds, their voices echoing against the buildings, their eyes fixed on her every move. The weight of being watched was immense, yet she carried it with the same discipline she always had. She smiled when the cameras rolled, rested in silence when they stopped, always conserving her fragile strength. And still, beneath it all, she remained haunted by the question of whether this life of endless visibility was truly hers, or whether it was a costume as temporary as the gown she wore on screen. The film's success was overwhelming. Audiences adored her Holly, critics praised her performance, and the image of her standing before Tiffany's became one of the most reproduced photographs of the century. It elevated her beyond actress and beyond fashion icon. She was now a myth, a symbol of elegance so pervasive that her very name became shorthand for a certain kind of beauty. Yet to be myth is to lose some measure of humanity, and the woman behind the dark glasses was far more complex than the image the world adored. For while Holly Golightly charmed the world, Audrey herself was wrestling with sorrow. She longed for stability, for love that would not falter, for a home where she could rest. She spoke often of her desire for family, for children, for a life of ordinary tenderness. Fame, though it had given her much, had also stolen the simplicity she craved. She moved between film sets and hotel rooms, between premieres and interviews, her life a sequence of borrowed spaces. In Holly's search for a place where I feel at home, one hears also Audrey's own quiet cry. There is an image that lingers after the film ends, not the glitter of parties, nor the playful laughter of city nights, but the fragile figure of Holly standing in the rain, clinging to a cat, uncertain of love, yet yearning for it. It is perhaps the closest the film comes to revealing the truth of Audrey herself, a woman adored by millions yet vulnerable in her solitude, holding on to love as though it might slip away at any moment. The black gown, the pearls, the cigarette holder, these became emblems of an age, endlessly imitated, endlessly admired. But behind them was the woman who still remembered tulip bulbs eaten in hunger, the girl who had carried messages for the resistance, the dancer whose body had betrayed her. She had traveled far from Arnhem to Fifth Avenue, but the past remained within her, shaping every movement, every glance, every silence. When the filming ended and the gowns were folded away, the silence of the dressing room returned once more. The silk no longer rustled, but pearls lay unclasped on a table, faintly glowing in the dim light. Perhaps in that silence she sat for a while, her reflection gazing back at her, the face of Holly Golightly blending with her own. Did she wonder then if the world would ever see her as more than an image, more than a dream? Did she fear that she herself was dissolving into the myth she had created? The sound that remains at the close of this chapter is not applause, nor the hum of the city, but the faint clink of pearls left abandoned in a quiet room. And from that small sound we step onward, for even as the world crowned her once more, new entanglements awaited, whispers of love, of scandal, of longing unfulfilled. The pearls unclasped upon the table glimmered faintly in the hush of the dressing room, their glow soft and incomplete, as though awaiting hands that would never fasten them again. From that faint clink, we move into the world that lay behind the pearls, a world of whispered desires and secret meetings, where Audrey's search for love wove itself into a tapestry of longing, scandal, and disappointment. For though the world adored her as the very emblem of elegance, the woman herself was not untouched by turbulence. Behind the wide eyes and quiet grace, her heart was restless, often reaching for tenderness in places where it could not endure. Hollywood was a realm of glamour, but also of illusions. Appearances shimmered like silk under light, while shadows gathered unseen. For Audrey, who had longed since childhood for the stability lost when her father abandoned her, the promise of love carried extraordinary weight. Yet time and again, those promises were met with betrayal, with impermanence, with the ache of absence. Some of her loves were whispered only in rumor. Others were publicly known, yet all carried within them the same fragile pattern: brief passion, fleeting happiness and sorrow that returned like a familiar guest. During Sabrina, she had been drawn to William Holden, whose charm and golden presence made him irresistible on screen and in life. Their affair was intense, their laughter filling evenings away from the set, yet it was a fire that could not last. Holden, already married, carried a reputation for infidelity, and beneath the warmth of their romance lay shadows she could not accept. When she discovered that he had no wish for more children, that the future she longed for, family, permanence, children, could not be found in him, the dream dissolved. The scandal of their liaison was whispered in Hollywood's corridors, adding to her image a subtle intrigue. But for Audrey, it was no mere intrigue. It was another wound, another promise unfulfilled. Other romances, too, passed quietly through her life. Some rumored, some confirmed. Actors, directors, men whose names glowed brightly in the world's eyes. She walked beside them, smiled for photographs, yet always seemed slightly apart. Was she searching in each for the father who had left, the stability denied to her? Was every romance an attempt to replace what had been broken in her earliest years? These are questions that linger, unanswerable, yet their echoes shape the path of her heart. There were moments when scandal seemed to touch her more directly. Rumors swirled, as they often do around those lifted to myth, about affairs conducted quietly, about betrayals endured or committed. Yet Audrey rarely spoke of such things. She maintained her poise, her silence, her ability to walk through storms without revealing their toll. The world saw only her elegance, but those who knew her understood that she was haunted, that her gentleness made her vulnerable to wounds others might have deflected. Love, for her, was not a casual pastime, but a necessity, a hunger as deep as the hunger she had known in war. She longed for safety, for tenderness, for a hand that would not let go, and so she gave herself fully, sometimes recklessly, trusting too quickly, hoping too deeply. Each disappointment left its mark, yet she continued to search as though she could not stop. Perhaps because she could not stop. The scandal of these affairs, if scandal it may be called, was not in the fact of them, but in the contrast they revealed. To the world she was angelic, pure, untouchable. To herself, she was a woman of flesh and longing, a woman who made mistakes, who yearned, who faltered. The dissonance between image and reality widened, and in that gap her sorrow grew. Yet she never sought to defend or explain herself. She let the world believe what it wished, just as she let men reveal themselves in time, and she bore the consequences in silence. Imagine her in those years, after a day on set, returning to a quiet room, the pearls once more unclasped upon a table. The city hums outside, the flashbulbs have faded, and she sits alone, the perfume of roses lingering faintly in the air from flowers sent earlier that day. She lifts a letter, perhaps, or a photograph, her fingers trembling slightly as she gazes at it. The world believes she is blessed beyond measure, But she feels instead the ache of absence, the hollow left by promises unkept. And yet, amid the pain, there was also resilience. For each affair that ended, each romance that faltered, she rose again, returned to her work, carried herself with dignity. She did not allow bitterness to consume her. She believed, perhaps naively, that love could still be found, that somewhere beyond the disappointments was the hand that would hold hers until the end. This belief, though it led her into sorrow, also gave her strength, for it kept her heart open even when it had been wounded again and again. Scandal touched her life, yes, but only in the way that scandal touches any life lived in longing. To speak of it as mere gossip is to miss the deeper truth that behind every whispered affair was a woman searching for what she had lost as a child, searching for permanence in a world that seemed always shifting beneath her. And perhaps that is why she played Holly Golightly so convincingly, why audiences felt her loneliness beneath the pearls, for she herself was never free of that same longing, never fully at rest in any embrace. The image that closes this chapter is not of scandalous headlines or whispered rumors, but of a door closing softly in the night. Behind it lies a room dimly lit, a woman seated at a dressing table, her hands resting upon pearls that remain unclasped. The air is filled with silence, with questions unspoken, with dreams deferred. And from that closed door, we move forward into another, where love will not come in whispers or in fleeting affairs, but in vows spoken at an altar. Vows that themselves would prove as fragile as silk in the rain. The soft closing of the door left the room in silence, pearls resting unclasped on the dressing table, the perfume of wilted roses still hanging faintly in the air. From that silence, another doorway opened, this one leading not to whispered affairs or fleeting passions, but to vows spoken before God, to the promise of permanence in the form of marriage. Yet even here, where devotion was sworn and rings exchanged, shadows followed close behind. For Audrey's first marriage, to actor Mel Ferrer, carried with it both tenderness and turbulence, both the sweetness of companionship and the hidden strain of control. Mel was older, experienced, seasoned by the theater and film worlds in which he had already lived many lives. To Audrey, still fragile from disappointments and longing for stability, he seemed a figure of strength. He wooed her with intensity, offering guidance, protection, and partnership. She, ever yearning for safety after the absence of her father and the betrayals of past lovers, leaned toward him with trust. They married in 1954, a ceremony held in Switzerland, quiet and intimate, away from the glare of Hollywood's relentless lights. Photographs from the day show her radiant yet reserved, as though joy was tempered by something unspoken. In the early days, their union carried the glow of collaboration. They appeared together at events, supported each other's careers, and for a time the arrangement seemed to fulfill her longing for a home, for an anchor. Yet beneath the appearances, a more complex dynamic emerged. Mel, by nature controlling, often sought to shape her career, to guide her choices, even to overshadow her light with his own ambitions. Audrey, gentle and yielding by temperament, acquiesced at first, allowing his voice to weigh heavily in decisions. But the imbalance of such a relationship, where one partner dominates and the other bends, could not remain hidden forever. Their work together revealed both the closeness and the strain. He directed her, advised her, stood beside her, yet whispers spread that he envied her success, that her rising star cast shadows upon his own. Audrey, for her part, tried to smooth over these tensions, to maintain harmony, for she feared conflict and sought always to preserve love. She believed in marriage as sanctuary, in vows as unbreakable, and so she endured what others might have resisted. The world saw them as a glamorous couple, but behind closed doors the weight of control pressed heavily upon her. Still, there were moments of genuine tenderness. She admired his intellect, his sophistication, his artistry. He supported her through performances that demanded more than she believed she could give. Together they navigated the whirl of Hollywood, the travels, the endless attention. For a time, she believed that in him she had found the fatherly strength she had long craved, the protector who would not abandon her. But even as she leaned upon him, she felt the cost of yielding too much of herself. Her natural independence, her quiet inner voice, sometimes grew muffled beneath his influence. The marriage brought joy, but it also brought sorrow in the most intimate of places. Audrey longed deeply for children, for a family to anchor her restless heart. Yet her frail health and the toll of her wartime malnutrition conspired against her. Miscarriages left her grieving, each one a silent wound carried with dignity, but felt profoundly. She spoke often of her desire to be a mother, and when at last her son Sean was born in 1960, it was a moment of radiant fulfillment. Yet the path to that joy was lined with grief, and the losses left their mark. In those years of yearning and sorrow, Mel's support sometimes faltered, his focus drifting toward his own pursuits, leaving her to bear the weight of longing largely alone. It is said that their relationship was marked by both dependence and distance, by intimacy and isolation. He was there, yet often not in the way she needed. She sought tenderness. He offered control. She sought stability. He offered structure. For a time, this balance held, but as the years passed, the cracks widened. The world saw their photographs, their elegant appearances, their poised smiles. But within their home, the silence grew heavier, the distance harder to bridge. Still, Audrey's loyalty remained. She believed in commitment, in perseverance, in the sanctity of the vows she had taken. She did not speak of her discontent, nor did she allow it to taint her public image. She carried herself always with dignity, as though to reveal her sorrow would be to betray the grace the world expected of her. Yet those who looked closely could see the sadness in her eyes, the weariness of a woman carrying more than she revealed. The marriage to Mel Ferrer was both sanctuary and prison, both gift and burden. It gave her the child she cherished, the companionship she craved, but it also confined her, restrained her, left her longing for a love less shadowed by control. The very qualities that had first drawn her to him, his strength, his certainty, became the walls within which she felt trapped. And as her career soared, as audiences adored her in film after film, the dissonance between her public triumph and private sorrow deepened. Imagine her in those years, sitting at a table after a long day of filming, Sean's cradle nearby, the quiet hum of domesticity around her. She smiles softly, yet her gaze drifts toward the window where the night spreads its silence. Beside her sits Mel, absorbed in his own thoughts, his presence felt yet distant. In that silence lies the truth of their union, a companionship marked by proximity, but not always by understanding. The image that closes this chapter is not of applause or scandal, but of a bouquet of roses placed upon a stage, their petals already beginning to wilt. They were once vibrant, once a symbol of devotion, but time and hidden strain have left them fragile, their beauty fading even as they remain outwardly graceful. And from that fading bouquet, we step onward into a new room of her life, where the cradle will rock, where joy and grief will intertwine in the intimate realm of motherhood, where love will be tested by the fragility of life itself. The bouquet of roses upon the stage, their petals curling inward, fading yet fragrant, leads us now into the realm where joy and sorrow are inseparable companions. For Audrey, who had long yearned not for crowns nor applause but for the warmth of family, motherhood was both a blessing and a trial. Her heart had always whispered of children, of a home filled with laughter and the quiet rhythm of ordinary days. Yet her body, weakened by the privations of war and the demands of fame, resisted her longing, granting her brief miracles only after seasons of grief. The cradle, when it finally stood beside her bed, carried not only her child, but also the ghosts of children she had lost. In the years of her marriage to Mel Ferrer, she endured more than one miscarriage. Each time she spoke little of it publicly, yet those close to her knew the depth of her sorrow. She'd always carried herself with composure, but behind her stillness was a well of grief. To Audrey, pregnancy was not merely an event, but the fulfillment of her deepest dream, the chance to give the love she had longed for since childhood. To lose that chance again and again was a wound deeper than any critic's words, deeper than the loneliness of fame. She bore these losses with dignity, but the shadow remained. At last, in 1960, her son, Sean, was born. The moment was radiant, a long-awaited answer to prayers whispered in the quiet of many nights. Photographs from those days show her cradling the infant with a tenderness that eclipsed all glamour. The world, accustomed to seeing her in gowns and jewels, now saw her face softened with maternal joy, her arms wrapped around the small life she had carried through months of fragile hope. In Sean, she found the anchor she had so desperately sought, the proof that her body, though frail, had not betrayed her completely. Yet even this joy was not without its shadows. Audrey continued to work, balancing the demands of her career with the needs of her child. The studios still sought her presence, audiences still longed for her light, and she, ever dutiful, returned to the screen. But each time she left Sean, her heart ached. She spoke often of the guilt she felt, the conflict between her role as mother and her role as actress. She had achieved the dream of family, yet fame tugged at her constantly, threatening to scatter the fragile peace she had built. Her marriage to Mel, already strained, grew more fragile in these years. The joy of their child could not erase the undercurrents of tension. His controlling nature, his unease at her greater success, his inability to offer the full tenderness she craved, all of this gnawed at the foundations of their union. Yet Audrey, bound by her belief in family, persevered. She believed in enduring, in sacrificing for the sake of her child, in holding together what had already begun to fray. In her films of the early 1960s, one can sense the duality of her life. On screen, she played women of elegance and charm, moving through glittering worlds of fashion and romance. Off-screen, she rocked her child, whispered lullabies, and mourned the children she had lost. The contrast between public image and private reality widened, yet she never allowed bitterness to emerge in her gaze. Instead, she carried both light and shadow together, as she always had. Imagine her in those years, returning home after long days of filming, slipping off her heels at the door, stepping quietly into Sean's nursery. The room is dim, a small lamp glowing beside the cradle. She leans over, her hand brushing the soft curve of her child's cheek, her heart filled with a tenderness the world could never witness. In that moment, she is not a star, not an icon, but simply a mother, fragile, exhausted, yet fulfilled. Yet even as she cherished this role, sorrow lingered. Subsequent pregnancies brought more miscarriages, each one reopening the wound, each one reminding her of the fragility of her body. She longed for a larger family, for brothers and sisters to surround Sean, but fate denied her this. Her joy in her son was therefore shadowed by the ache of absence, the quiet knowledge of what might have been. And so, even in her happiest moments, a trace of sorrow lingered, as though joy itself could never stand alone. Her health, too, remained delicate. Years of malnutrition during the war had left her vulnerable, and the strain of pregnancies, miscarriages, and the demands of acting weighed heavily upon her. She fainted often, grew thin, battled exhaustion. Yet she pressed on, unwilling to let weakness define her. She spoke little of her suffering, preferring instead to maintain the image of grace the world expected. But those who knew her understood that behind the luminous smile was a woman constantly battling her own fragility. The cradle, rocking gently in the dim light, becomes the image of this chapter, both a symbol of fulfillment and a reminder of loss. Within it lay her beloved child, her most cherished joy. Yet beside it lingered the shadows of children she had never held, dreams that had dissolved in silence. The rocking motion itself seemed to echo her life, swaying between joy and sorrow, between presence and absence, between love found and love lost. And so, as we leave this room with its softly rocking cradle, we move onward into the years when she tried to balance the roles of mother and star, wife and icon. It was a balancing act that could never be sustained without cost, for the trains of her life pulled in opposite directions, one toward the screen's relentless demands, the other toward the quiet hearth she longed for. And the sound that carries us forward is the faint creak of the cradle's rock, mingling with the distant hum of a departing train disappearing into mist. The faint creak of the cradle lingered, blending now with the hum of a train disappearing into mist, a sound both soothing and sorrowful. It carried with it the sense of movement, of departure, of a life pulled in two directions at once. For Audrey, the 1960s became a decade defined by this duality, her role as mother, tender and yearning, set against her role as star, demanded and adored. The trains of her existence, one bound for the hearth and one for the stage, never ran on the same track. She rode between them, exhausted yet graceful, always presenting to the world a composed face, while inside she wrestled with the exhaustion of a life divided. Her films of this period glowed with brilliance. My Fair Lady charade, The Nun's Story, Paris When It Sizzles, and others cemented her as one of the most luminous presences in cinema. Each role revealed another facet of her being: Eliza Doolittle's transformation, Sister Luke's struggle between faith and obedience, Regina's dance between love and deceit. Audiences adored her, critics praised her, directors sought her. She had become one of the defining figures of her generation, her name synonymous with elegance and depth. Yet each time she stepped into a role, she left behind a child waiting at home, a life half-lived in absence. The demands of Hollywood were relentless. Filming required long days, travel to distant cities, endless interviews and premieres. Even as she cherished her work, Audrey felt the constant pull of Sean's small hand reaching for hers, of the lullabies she could not sing because she was in another country, of the milestones she sometimes missed. She confessed often that she longed simply to be a mother, to step away from the cameras, to live a quiet life. And yet, bound by contracts, by obligations, by the relentless expectations of the industry, she continued. The applause that greeted each performance was genuine, but in her heart it was often accompanied by guilt. Her marriage to Mel Ferrer grew increasingly strained in these years. The imbalance of their partnership deepened as her fame rose higher and his influence waned. Whispers circulated that he resented her success, that he sought to control her choices, that their union, outwardly elegant, was inwardly fraught. Audrey, ever loyal, endured for as long as she could, unwilling to give up the idea of family. But the silences grew heavier, the arguments sharper, the distance greater. Even the presence of their beloved Sean could not bridge the divide. The train of her marriage was pulling away, its wheels grinding against tracks that no longer ran parallel. In the midst of these struggles, her health continued to falter. The thinness that audiences mistook for elegance was in truth the mark of strain, of exhaustion, of a body never fully healed from the hunger of her youth. She suffered illnesses, fainting spells, bouts of fatigue, yet she rarely allowed these to show. On screen, she remained luminous, her eyes shining, her posture poised. Only in private did the fragility emerge. Only in the quiet of her own home did she let her body collapse into the arms of rest. And yet, amid all this weariness, she gave performances of remarkable power. In the nun story, she poured into the role of Sister Luke all her own struggles with obedience, sacrifice, and doubt. The film became one of her most profound, its themes echoing her inner life. Audiences saw a woman, torn between duty and desire, between the world and the cloister, between submission and independence. Was this not Audrey herself, caught between Hollywood and the hearth, between the demands of fame and the yearning for family? The film's quiet, contemplative tone mirrored her own spirit, and in her performance, one can glimpse her private sorrows transfigured into art. The train carried her also into My Fair Lady, where she became Eliza Doolittle, transformed from flower girl to duchess. The role was grand, the costumes opulent, the sets dazzling. Yet behind the glitter was controversy. Her singing voice was deemed insufficient, and much of it was dubbed by another. She accepted this with her usual humility, but the wound remained. For all her success, she was still reminded of her limitations, still forced to yield to others' control. To audiences, she was radiant, unforgettable. To herself, she was again the girl whose body had betrayed her dreams of ballet, the woman whose voice was deemed not enough. Between these films, she moved constantly, her life a blur of airports, hotels, and studios. Yet always she carried with her photographs of Sean, letters from home, small reminders of the life she wished were her only one. Friends spoke of her devotion as a mother, how she balanced every spare moment around her child, how she would retreat quickly after filming to spend time with him. She never allowed fame to erase her maternal instinct. Rather, it was the core around which her life revolved, even as the world demanded otherwise. But the tension of balance grew heavier. Fame was relentless, family fragile. The two trains pulled her in opposite directions, and she could not ride both forever. Her marriage cracked beneath the strain. Her body weakened. Her spirit grew weary. Yet still, she smiled for photographs. Still, she carried herself with elegance. Still, she gave the world the illusion of ease. Only those closest to her glimpsed the exhaustion in her eyes, the longing for rest. Imagine her in those years, sitting alone in a train compartment after a long day of filming, the countryside passing in a blur outside the window. She holds in her hands a letter from Sean, the handwriting childlike, the words simple. She reads it again and again, her eyes softening, her heart aching. Outside, the mist gathers over fields and rivers, the train pressing onward into darkness. She leans her head against the glass, torn between pride in her work and sorrow at her absence. The world sees her as the radiant star on screen, but here, in the quiet of the train, she is simply a mother yearning for her child. And so this chapter closes with that train disappearing into mist, carrying with it both triumph and loneliness, applause and silence. It moves ever onward, unable to stop, pulling her further from what she most desired, even as it carried her into the heights of fame. And from that vanishing train, we step now into the shattering sound of something more final, the quiet collapse of marriage, the breaking of vows once believed eternal, the shattering of glass in a sink, fragile and irreversible. The train dissolved into mist, its distant hum swallowed by silence, and in its place came the shattering of glass against porcelain, a sound sharp and final, like vows breaking in the night. It was not heard by crowds or audiences, but only within the confines of a private home, where silence pressed heavily against the walls. Audrey's marriage to Mel Ferrer, once a sanctuary she fought to preserve, was unraveling thread by thread. Outwardly, they still appeared as a couple of elegance, poised together on red carpets, smiling faintly for the cameras. But behind closed doors, the fractures widened, The silences deepened, and the love that had once seemed a refuge had become instead a burden too heavy to bear. The world, of course, did not see the shadows. It saw the photographs. Audrey in her gowns, Mel at her side, their son sometimes cradled in her arms. The public imagined a charmed life, a family of glamour. Yet beneath these appearances, the reality was starkly different. Mel's controlling nature, his jealousy of her immense fame, and his inability to offer the tenderness she longed for, all corroded the bond they had forged. Audrey, who had always sought harmony, endured for years, believing that family must be preserved at all costs. She silenced her own discontent, convinced herself that loyalty would be enough, that perseverance could mend what was broken. But love cannot survive on endurance alone. Their home in Switzerland became less a haven than a cage, its alpine beauty contrasting with the tensions that filled its rooms. Audrey devoted herself to Sean, pouring her love into motherhood, even as her marriage crumbled. She continued to work, her films illuminating screens across the world, her image untouched by the sorrows she carried. Yet the strain was evident to those who looked closely. She grew thinner, her eyes more shadowed, her smile quieter. Friends spoke of her sadness, her fragility, her desperate desire for peace. The final breaking point came slowly, not as a sudden rupture, but as a gradual erosion. Arguments became more frequent, silences more unbearable. Mel sought to maintain his control. Audrey withdrew further into herself. By the late 1960s, the union was little more than a formality. In 1968, they divorced, the legal end to a marriage that had long since dissolved in spirit. For Audrey, who valued loyalty above all, the divorce was a profound wound. She had believed in permanence, in vows that must not be broken. To see her marriage collapse was to face once again the loss she had known since childhood, the ache of abandonment, the shattering of sanctuary. Yet even in this sorrow, she carried herself with dignity. She spoke little publicly of the reasons, offering no bitterness, no accusations. She protected Sean from the shadows of discord, ensuring that his life remained as stable as possible. She turned once more to her work, to the screen, to the craft that had always allowed her to transform sorrow into art. Films such as Two for the Road reflected her own struggles, stories of love tested, marriages fraying, journeys that mirrored her own. Watching her on screen in those roles, one sees not performance alone, but lived experience, sorrow transfigured into expression. The divorce left her weary, vulnerable, uncertain of what lay ahead. Yet it also opened a space for change. She was still young, still luminous, still sought by directors across the world. But more than fame, she longed now for healing, for a new beginning, for love that would not control or diminish her, but allow her to be herself. The failure of her first marriage did not harden her heart. It left her searching still, her yearning for tenderness undimmed. She believed, against the weight of disappointment, that love might yet be found. Imagine her in those years, sitting alone at her dressing table after the divorce, the house quiet, Sean asleep in his room. She looks into the mirror, her face pale with fatigue, her eyes shadowed with sorrow. On the table lies the faint trace of broken glass, shards swept aside, a reminder of what is ended. She rests her hand lightly against her cheek, and for a moment the tears she rarely allowed herself in public slip quietly down. But then, as always, she straightens, lifts her chin, gathers her composure. She will walk into the world again, carrying her sorrow as she carries her grace, never allowing one to eclipse the other. The public image remained untouched. The world still saw her as the angel of elegance. Her films still enchanted millions. Her style still shaped the fashion of an era. But the woman herself was marked by sorrow, her heart carrying the fracture of vows broken, her spirit weary from endurance. Yet in this very fracture lay also a new beginning, for from endings come the possibility of rebirth. The chapter of Mel Ferrer closed with quiet dignity, without scandal, without spectacle. A woman who had once endured hunger and war, now endured the dissolution of love. Both experiences left her scarred, yet both also deepened the well of her being. She emerged fragile, but also resilient, carrying within her the quiet conviction that even after loss, life could still offer beauty. And so this part of her journey ends not with applause or acclaim, but with the image of broken glass in a sink, fragments glittering faintly in the dim light. They cannot be mended, cannot be made whole again. Yet from their sharpness arises a strange kind of clarity, the knowledge that one must move forward, even with wounds unhealed. And from that quiet glitter of fragments, we step into the next chapter, where love will come again, passionate and intoxicating, yet once more fraught with shadows. Another photograph that will fade beneath the sunlight of time. The broken glass in the sink caught the light briefly before fading into dull fragments. And from that fading gleam, we move now into another chapter, where love returned with the shimmer of new promise, only to be worn down again beneath the harshness of time. After the ending of her marriage to Mel Ferrer, Audrey sought not the solitude of bitterness, but the renewal of companionship. Her heart, though scarred, remained open, for she had always believed in love as a necessity, a shelter, a balm for the wounds of life. It was this openness that drew her in 1969 into the arms of Andrea Dotti, an Italian psychiatrist of charm and sophistication, a man whose warmth seemed to offer the tenderness she had long been denied. Their meeting was filled with the radiance of renewal. Audrey was traveling, fragile from divorce yet still luminous, when she encountered Andrea. He was younger than she, confident and carried with him the ease of European aristocracy mingled with professional accomplishment. To Audrey, weary from years of strain, he seemed a figure of stability, of cultured refinement, of passion unburdened by the jealousies that had corroded her first marriage. Their courtship was swift, intense, marked by romance that seemed at once spontaneous and inevitable. To the world, it was a story of rebirth, the star who had suffered sorrow now finding joy again. They married in 1969 in a ceremony that carried less of the hidden tensions of her first wedding and more of the atmosphere of hope. Photographs show her radiant in simplicity, her smile tender, her eyes alive with the possibility of new beginnings. Soon after, she became pregnant again, and in 1970 gave birth to her second son, Luca. The arrival of this child filled her with profound joy, for she had longed to give Sean a sibling, longed to expand the circle of her family. Holding Luca in her arms, she seemed to have achieved the dream she had whispered since girlhood: a home, children, love. For a time, she withdrew from the relentless world of Hollywood to devote herself fully to motherhood, stepping away from films to focus on the life she cherished most. But even as she embraced domesticity, shadows began to gather. Andrea, though intelligent and accomplished, was also restless, drawn to pleasures beyond the confines of marriage. His infidelities became whispers first, then rumors, then undeniable truths. Audrey, loyal and forgiving by nature, sought to overlook them, to preserve her family, to protect her children from the fracture of another broken home. She endured more than many would have, always hoping that his waywardness would cease, that his devotion to her and their sons would outweigh his wandering desires. Yet the betrayals multiplied, and the trust that should have anchored their union was eroded little by little. Her response was not anger, but sorrow, not confrontation, but quiet endurance. Friends spoke of her tears, of her loneliness, of her yearning for constancy. Yet she rarely allowed bitterness to shape her words. She remained committed to her children, to the preservation of their sense of stability, even when her own heart was heavy. In interviews, she spoke of happiness, of fulfillment, never revealing the fractures within. She believed that her private pain must never overshadow her public grace. That dignity must be preserved even when love was crumbling. And still, even amid betrayal, there were moments of genuine joy. She loved Italy, the slower rhythm of life there, the beauty of its landscapes, the warmth of its people. She embraced the role of mother wholeheartedly, finding solace in the daily tasks of raising children, in the small joys of family meals, in the laughter of her sons. For her, motherhood was the truest role she had ever played, and though Andrea's faithlessness wounded her, her devotion to her children anchored her. The marriage lasted over a decade, longer than many might have expected given its turbulence. Audrey's loyalty and her reluctance to break vows kept her bound long after the joy had faded. Yet by the early 1980s, the distance between them had grown insurmountable. Andrea's affairs were no longer whispers, but realities too painful to ignore. Audrey, weary of enduring alone, weary of offering forgiveness that was never honored, made the difficult decision to leave. In 1982, their marriage ended in divorce, the second great fracture of her quest for permanence. The world once again saw only the surface, the elegance of her appearance, the grace of her demeanor, the timeless beauty that seemed untouched by sorrow. But beneath she carried another wound, another proof that love, though longed for, could not always be trusted. The angel the world adored was, in truth, a woman scarred by betrayals, a woman whose heart had been tested again and again. Yet she did not allow these sorrows to harden her. She remained gentle, remained compassionate, remained open to life's possibilities. Imagine her in Italy during those years, walking quietly through a garden in the late afternoon. The sun sets low over the hills, the scent of cypress and rosemary in the air. She carries Luca by the hand, Sean walking just ahead. Their laughter fills the space, light and free, and for a moment her heart is at peace. She looks at them with eyes that shine, her sons the truest love she has ever known. Yet when the laughter fades and the children run ahead, she lingers behind, her gaze drifting to the horizon. There, in the distance, lies the ache of betrayal, the sorrow of a marriage unraveling. But for the sake of her children, she straightens her shoulders, smiles, and walks on. Her marriage to Andrea Dotti was both passion and disappointment, a chapter that gave her the joy of another son, but also the sorrow of another betrayal. It revealed again the pattern of her life: love sought with hope, endured with loyalty, lost with sorrow. The world called her lucky, blessed, radiant, but those who looked deeper saw the truth, that behind her grace was a woman carrying wounds invisible to the eye, wounds that no costume or camera could conceal. And so this chapter closes not with the laughter of children nor the fragrance of gardens, but with the image of a photograph left too long in sunlight. Once vivid, once cherished, it has begun to fade, its colors softening into shadows, its edges curling with time. The memory remains, but the clarity dissolves. From that fading photograph, we step onward into the quiet of seclusion, where she withdrew from the stage of Hollywood to seek peace in Switzerland, snow falling silently upon an empty garden path. The photograph left too long in the sun faded slowly, its colors leached into a pale memory, its edges curled and brittle. From that fading image, we move now into the years when Audrey, weary of betrayals and exhausted by the relentless demands of cinema, turned away from the glare of the screen and sought instead the solace of seclusion. Switzerland became her refuge, its snow-frosted valleys and quiet gardens offering a rhythm of life that contrasted sharply with the endless applause and bright lights that had defined her earlier years. Here, in the stillness of the alpine air, she sought peace, not the fleeting peace of applause silenced, nor the deceptive calm of a photograph left to fade, but a deeper kind of peace, born of silence, of simplicity, of days unmarked by schedules or scripts. She had, by this time, given the world more than enough of her light. The films of the 1950s and 1960s had established her as a legend, her image woven into the fabric of global memory. She had been crowned by the Academy, celebrated in Paris and Rome, adored in New York and London. She had worn gowns that became emblems, spoken lines that became immortal. But fame, however luminous, had always weighed heavily on her. She never truly sought it. It had found her, claimed her, and bound her in obligations she accepted with grace, but never with hunger. And so, as her second marriage frayed and her children grew, she made the choice to step back, to leave Hollywood not in scandal or bitterness, but in quiet refusal. In Switzerland, she purchased a home surrounded by gardens and orchards, a place where her sons could grow in freedom and where she could walk unseen among trees. The house, La Paisible, the peaceful one, became both her sanctuary and her declaration. It was here that she turned her attention not to scripts or costumes, but to the rhythms of seasons, the growth of her children, the companionship of close friends. She woke in the mornings not to the call of cameras, but to the chirping of birds, to the slow drift of fog across the hills. For a woman who had carried so much sorrow in silence, this retreat was less an escape than a return to simplicity, to authenticity, to the life she had always longed for. Yet seclusion did not mean absence. She continued to be present in the cultural imagination, her image still appearing in magazines, her past films still beloved. Directors sought her, tempted her with roles, pleaded for her return. But she refused more often than she accepted, weighing each offer against her desire for stability, for family, for rest. She no longer wished to live divided between trains, no longer wished to choose between screen and hearth. Instead, she chose hearth, and in doing so, chose herself. This retreat did not erase sorrow. The failures of her marriages, the betrayals she had endured, the miscarriages that had scarred her heart, all remained. But in Switzerland, she found a space where grief could soften into reflection, where silence could hold her without judgment. She became a devoted mother, her days filled with the ordinariness she had long craved, preparing meals, walking in gardens, reading stories, tending to flowers. To some, this might have seemed a diminishment, a fading of a star. But to Audrey, it was fulfillment. The truest role she had ever desired was not that of princess or socialite, not even of fashion icon, but of mother, of homemaker, of woman living gently within her chosen circle. Visitors who came to La Paisible spoke of her humility, her warmth, her ability to put aside her own legend and meet others with kindness. She did not live as a recluse, hidden from all, but she lived without spectacle, without pretense. The garden paths became her stage, her sons her audience, the snow her curtain. There was a quiet dignity in this choice, a refusal to cling to fame for its own sake, a rare ability to let go of what so many others fought desperately to retain. Yet even in this retreat, she remained vulnerable to love's entanglements. She entered into relationships, some fleeting, some lasting, seeking still the tenderness she had long craved. One such bond was with Robert Wolders, a Dutch actor who became her companion in the later years of her life. With him, she found a kind of contentment, a companionship free of the controlling shadows of her earlier marriages. Their love was not marked by scandal or betrayal, but by quiet devotion, and in it she discovered at last something close to the peace she had sought for so long. Imagine her in those years, walking through her garden as snow began to fall, the silence of winter settling over the land. Her coat is wrapped around her slender frame. Her boots crunch softly against the frozen earth. She pauses to gaze at the trees, their branches etched in frost, their silence echoing her own. She breathes deeply, her breath rising in small clouds before her. In this moment, she is not Audrey Hepburn the star, nor Audrey Hepburn the wounded lover, but simply Audrey, a woman walking in her garden, present in her own life. And yet, even in Switzerland, she could not fully escape the world's gaze. Journalists sought her. Photographers lingered at the edges. Fans mailed letters filled with devotion. She responded with kindness, but she did not allow them to penetrate the sanctuary she had built. She knew, perhaps better than anyone, that fame was a fragile fabric, one that could unravel if pulled too tightly. She chose instead to weave a different fabric, one of quiet days, of maternal devotion, of simple joys. The closing image of this chapter is not of lights or gowns, nor of photographs fading in the sun, but of snow falling silently upon an empty garden path. The house stands quiet, its windows glowing softly against the winter dusk. Inside, laughter rises from the dining room where her children sit, their voices warm against the cold. Outside, the snow covers the earth in white, erasing scars, softening edges, granting peace. And from this snowfall, we move into the next chapter, where love's embers still glow, but are threatened again by winds of betrayal, where candles will flicker and be extinguished by sudden breezes, leaving questions unanswered in the dark. The snow fell softly upon the empty garden path, each flake dissolving into silence as if to cover the earth's old wounds with a fleeting shroud of purity. From that hush of winter, we step into the chamber of her later years, where love returned not as the grand passion of youth, but as flickering embers, fragile and uncertain, often threatened by sudden breezes. If her earlier romances had been marked by intensity and scandal whispered behind closed doors, these later entanglements carried instead the quiet persistence of a heart that refused to abandon its search. Audrey, though scarred by betrayal and wearied by disappointment, never fully relinquished her belief in love. Like a candle flame trembling in a draught, she shielded it with cupped hands, determined to keep it alive even when shadows pressed close. Her marriage to Andrea Dotti had dissolved, leaving her once again a woman of dignity but solitude. The world expected perhaps that she would retreat entirely into motherhood, content with her children and her home. But Audrey's heart remained restless, still reaching, still hopeful. She had always longed for tenderness, for companionship untainted by control or betrayal. And in the years that followed, she found it not in the form of marriage once more, but in the quiet devotion of Robert Wolders. Robert was himself an actor, Dutch by birth, and carried with him a gentleness that contrasted with the dominating presences of Mel Ferrer and Andrea Dotti. Their companionship began in the late 1970s, after the ruins of her second marriage had left her weary. With him, she discovered not the fevered passion of early romance, but the steady warmth of companionship. He was attentive, kind, content to walk beside her rather than lead or overshadow. For perhaps the first time, she experienced a love that did not demand or wound, but simply accompanied. In later interviews, she would call these years with Robert the happiest of her life, a quiet declaration that at last she had found a love that did not harm. Yet even here, whispers lingered. The world, eager to attach intrigue to her name, spun rumors of fleeting affairs, of passions ignited and extinguished like candles in the night. Some of these whispers were baseless, born of the insatiable hunger for stories about those elevated to myth. Others carried fragments of truth, for Audrey, though devoted to Robert, was still a woman vulnerable to the ache of loneliness when distance separated them. But unlike the scandals of her earlier years, these rumors carried less sting, for by now she was no longer the ingenue bound by public expectation, but a mature woman who had earned the right to live as she chose. Her own attitude toward love had softened. She no longer believed in fairy tales, in permanence unbroken. She knew too well that marriages falter, that vows are fragile, that passion fades, yet she still believed in companionship, in tenderness, in the healing power of being cherished. With Robert, she traveled, walked garden paths, shared dinners by candlelight. Their life together was not marked by glittering premieres or theatrical headlines, but by small gestures, holding hands on a quiet evening, reading together in silence, tending to her beloved dogs in the garden. These moments, small to the world, were immense to her, and yet questions lingered as they always had. Did she, even in her later happiness, still carry the hunger of the child abandoned by her father, the ache of the woman betrayed by her husbands? Did she still wonder whether love could ever be trusted, or whether it was always, by its nature, a flame doomed to flicker and die? These questions cannot be answered, but in her eyes, even in photographs from these years, one sees both contentment and melancholy, joy and wistfulness intertwined. She had found companionship, yes, but the wounds of the past had not vanished. They remained, softened but unhealed, like scars hidden beneath silk. Imagine her in Switzerland during those years, sitting beside Robert in the quiet of an evening. The fire burns low in the hearth, casting a soft glow upon the walls. Outside, the snow lies thick upon the ground, the world muffled in silence. She sits in a chair, her legs tucked beneath her, a book resting on her lap. Robert is beside her, their hands entwined, their silence companionable. She glances at him, her smile faint but true, her eyes reflecting both gratitude and the lingering shadow of what she has endured. In that moment, love is not a grand declaration, but a quiet presence, a candle flame shielded from the wind. Still, the world persisted in its fascination with her. Journalists speculated, rumors circled, stories were told of fleeting glances, of secret meetings. But Audrey, by now, was beyond caring for such gossip. She had learned that the world would always project its desires upon her, always imagine her as more myth than woman. She did not attempt to correct them, nor did she offer herself to their scrutiny. She lived her life quietly, privately, holding close those she loved, shielding her sons from intrusion, finding joy in simplicity. And so this chapter of her life is not defined by scandal, though whispers persisted, but by the fragility of love itself. It reveals a woman who, even after betrayals, continued to hope, who refused to allow disappointment to harden her heart. She remained tender, vulnerable, willing to love again. This willingness, though it brought her sorrow, also brought her grace, for it showed that her spirit, despite all wounds, had not closed itself to life. The image that closes this part is of a candle set upon a windowsill, its flame flickering as a sudden breeze slips through a gap. For a moment the light trembles, nearly extinguished, then steadies again. It is fragile, uncertain, but alive. And from that candle, we step into the next chapter, where she would briefly return to the screen in a role that confronted not only love, but mortality. A cloak laid across a stone bench, a woman on film embodying the quiet acceptance of aging, of endings, of time. The candle flame on the windowsill trembled in the sudden breeze, nearly extinguished before steadying once more, its glow softened by the winter glass. From that fragile light we move now to another flicker, a brief return to the screen after years of retreat, a performance that seemed less an act than a quiet meditation on love, age, and mortality. It was in 1976 that Audrey stepped again before the cameras, this time not as the ingenue of Roman holiday, nor the glittering icon of breakfast at Tiffany's, but as Marian, the woman who had grown older alongside the legendary Robin Hood, played by Sean Connery. The film was Robin and Marian, and within it lay a mirror of her own life, a reflection of time's passing, of beauty softened by years, of love revisited when much has already been lost. For audiences who had frozen her in their memory as the eternal figure of youth, her return in this role was a revelation. Here was Audrey, no longer the slender girl whose wide eyes embodied innocence, but a woman who carried the grace of maturity, who bore in her face the quiet wisdom of a life lived through joy and sorrow. She did not seek to conceal her age, nor to compete with younger stars. Instead, she embraced the role of a woman who had loved, endured, and now faced the final chapters of her story with dignity. The film itself was infused with melancholy. Robin, aged and weary from battles, returns to find Marian, who has long since left the forest and taken vows as a nun. Their reunion is tender, tinged with the sorrow of years apart, with the knowledge that love, though rekindled, cannot erase time. In their scenes together, Connery and Hepburn embody not youthful passion, but the bittersweet recognition of love that survives even as bodies age and destinies near their close. For Audrey, who had lived her own story of loves found and lost, the role resonated deeply. In her performance, one senses not mere acting, but the transmutation of her own life's sorrows into art. She walked across the screen not as a star seeking to reclaim fame, but as a woman willing to show herself as she was. The lines of her face, the softness of her movements, the shadow in her gaze, all revealed her humanity, stripped of illusion. Audiences who expected glamour found instead something more profound: authenticity. Here was Audrey Hepburn, not as myth, but as woman, carrying within her both the fragility of past wounds and the resilience of survival. The film did not become a monumental success in the way her earlier works had, but it held within it a quiet beauty, a contemplative tone that matched the stage of life she had entered. Critics noted the poignancy of her performance, the tenderness she brought to Marian, the way she allowed age to be seen not as decline, but as a new kind of radiance. For Audrey, the role was not a return to the frenzy of Hollywood, but a farewell of sorts, a final bow before she stepped back once more into seclusion. Her decision to leave cinema again after Robin and Marian was not born of rejection, but of choice. She had tasted fame, lived its demands, carried its burdens. She no longer needed to prove herself, nor did she hunger for the applause of audiences. What she longed for was peace, family, authenticity. And so, after giving the world one last gift of her presence on film, she returned to Switzerland, to gardens and quiet, to the rhythm of ordinary days. And yet this role left a mark on her legacy, for it showed her not only as the angelic figure of youth, but as the woman who had grown, aged, endured. It allowed audiences to see that her beauty was not confined to innocence, but deepened by experience, that her grace was not diminished by time, but enriched by it. She had begun her career as a princess longing for freedom. She closed it as a woman who had lived through the fullness of love and loss. Imagine her on the set of that film, in costume as Marian, walking across a stone courtyard at dusk. The cloak she wears is heavy, its folds trailing softly behind her. She pauses by a bench of weathered stone, its surface cold to the touch, and rests her hand upon it. For a moment she closes her eyes, feeling the chill of the stone seep into her palm, feeling also the weight of time pressing gently against her. Around her, the crew prepares cameras, adjusts lights, waits for the signal to begin. But in that private pause, she is no longer Marian alone, nor Audrey the actress, but simply a woman, standing between past and future, carrying all that has been, awaiting all that is yet to come. The film ends with Robin and Marion united, not in life but in death, their love sealed beyond time. It is a tender, sorrowful ending, and in it, one cannot help but glimpse the reflection of Audrey's own journey. Love fragile yet enduring, life beautiful yet finite, the body frail but the spirit luminous. To watch her in that final scene is to see not only a character, but the woman herself, offering a farewell not only to Robin Hood, but to the screen, to the myth of perpetual youth, to the audience that had claimed her for so long. And so, this chapter closes not with applause, but with the image of a cloak left behind upon a stone bench, empty, its folds gathering the dust of time. It is an image of absence, but also of continuity. For though the body departs, the imprint remains. From that cloak upon the bench, we step forward into the next part of her journey, where her life would turn away from cinema entirely, where the hunger of her childhood and the compassion of her soul would lead her into lands of suffering, where drums beat in distant villages and the cries of children would call forth her deepest purpose. The cloak left behind upon the stone bench, its folds heavy with dust and memory, becomes the threshold through which we step into a different chapter, where the stage was no longer lit by chandeliers, nor the screen framed by velvet curtains, but by the raw light of distant lands where suffering cried out for witness. For Audrey, who had spent so much of her life embodying dreams and illusions, the later years of her journey brought her instead into the realm of reality most harrowing, yet also most sacred. It was here, in the villages of Africa, in the refugee camps of Asia, in the parched fields of Latin America, that she discovered what would become her truest role, the emissary of compassion. Her bond with UNICEF was not an accident, nor merely the choice of a famous woman seeking purpose after fame. It was rooted deep within her own childhood, in the hunger she had endured during the war, in the thinness of her body when food was gone, in the relief she had felt when aid workers arrived with milk and medicine. She carried those memories within her always, and when the opportunity arose to serve the organization that had once served her, she embraced it not as duty, but as destiny. She had been the child who received. Now she would become the woman who gave. Her first journeys as a UNICEF Goodwill ambassador took her into places the world often ignored. She traveled to Ethiopia during famine, to Bangladesh amid floods, to Somalia, where war and hunger had devastated entire generations. She did not come as a star, nor did she carry with her the aura of Hollywood. She came instead as a woman who knelt among children, who sat in the dust beside mothers, who listened more than she spoke. The cameras that followed her were not there to capture glamour, but to carry testimony, to bring into the living rooms of distant lands the truth of suffering too often hidden. Audrey spoke of what she saw with a simplicity that cut through indifference. She described the hollow eyes of starving children, the swollen bellies of those without food, the frailty of bodies wasted by hunger. She did not embellish, nor did she indulge in despair. She spoke as one who knew, as one who had carried hunger in her own bones, as one who understood the indignity of powerlessness. And because she spoke not as a politician nor as a detached observer, but as Audrey Hepburn, the woman who had once enchanted the world, people listened. Her fame, which she had never sought for herself, became a tool she now wielded for others. The world, accustomed to seeing her in gowns and pearls, was confronted instead with images of her in simple clothes, her hair pulled back, her eyes filled with sorrow as she held a starving child in her arms. These images unsettled and moved, for they revealed both continuity and transformation, the same grace, the same luminous presence, but now turned entirely toward service. She had shed the cloak of myth and revealed the deeper truth of her being, not an icon of beauty alone, but a vessel of compassion. Her devotion to this work was tireless, though her health was already fragile. She traveled often, enduring harsh conditions, long flights, difficult terrains. She walked through refugee camps where the air was filled with dust and despair, where the cries of the hungry pierced the silence. She listened. She comforted. She bore witness. And when she returned to the halls of power, to the United Nations, to parliaments, to conferences, she spoke with quiet authority, urging the world to act, to give, to remember the humanity of those it would rather forget. Imagine her in Ethiopia, standing beneath a blazing sun, surrounded by children whose faces bore the marks of famine. She bends to offer water to a girl whose eyes are dim with exhaustion. The camera captures the moment, but the deeper truth is unseen, that in this act Audrey is not performing for the world but living the truth of her own memory. She remembers the hunger of her youth, the thinness of her legs when she too wasted away, the relief when milk was placed in her hands. She does not see strangers, she sees herself. Her work was not without cost. Each journey drained her physically and emotionally. She returned home often exhausted, her body weakened, her spirit heavy with the weight of what she had seen. Yet she refused to retreat. She believed that to turn away was to betray those whose cries had no other witness. She used the fame she had once wished to escape as a beacon, now turned outward, drawing attention not to herself but to the suffering of others. In this, she found redemption, the transformation of her own wounds into service. Her companions in this work noted her humility. She did not demand special treatment, did not carry herself as a star. She ate the same food as those she visited, endured the same discomforts, walked the same dusty paths. Her grace was not performance but presence, her compassion not obligation but instinct. Those who met her in these settings spoke not of the actress, but of the woman, the mother, the listener who carried their stories with reverence. In these years, she became less a figure of cinema than a saintly presence in the eyes of many. Yet she never sought such titles. She insisted she was simply doing what anyone should, what all could. She spoke not of charity but of responsibility, not of pity but of solidarity. Her voice, gentle yet resolute, reminded the world that the children she cradled were not statistics but lives, not distant tragedies but human kin. The image that closes this chapter is not of gowns nor of chandeliers, but of the sound of distant drums in a dry land, a rhythm rising against silence. She stands among the people, her figure slender and frail, her eyes luminous with sorrow and compassion. The drums echo the heartbeat of a world too easily forgotten, and in their sound, one hears both the urgency of need and the persistence of hope. And from those drums, we move into the next chapter, where the toll of illness would begin to silence her travels, where the fragility of her body, long foreshadowed, would return with final insistence, fluttering like white curtains in the winter light. The distant drums in the dry land faded slowly, their rhythm dissolving into silence, and in their place came a quieter sound, the soft flutter of white curtains stirring in the winter light. It was within that fragile motion that Audrey entered the final chapter of her earthly life, for her body, long delicate and marked by the hunger of war and the strains of fame, began to falter beneath an illness that no grace of will could resist. Cancer came upon her, not with sudden violence, but with the quiet persistence of a shadow lengthening across the floor, a shadow that could not be dispelled by light alone. In the late 1980s, after years of tireless work with UNICEF, she began to feel the first signs of weariness that no rest could soothe. The journeys to distant lands had taken their toll. The harsh climates, the endless flights, the emotional weight of suffering witnessed had all pressed upon her fragile frame. Friends noticed her thinness, the deepening fatigue in her movements, the way her luminous eyes seemed sometimes clouded with pain. Yet she spoke little of it, never wishing to burden others, always determined to continue her service. For her, the cries of starving children mattered more than the tremors of her own body. The diagnosis came at last in 1992, a rare form of abdominal cancer, insidious and advanced. For a woman who had always carried fragility, who had fought through illness in silence, the news was both devastating and strangely unsurprising. She accepted it with the same quiet composure with which she had accepted every sorrow in her life. There was no outcry, no rage, only a gentle acknowledgement that her time was drawing near. She confided in those closest to her, sought treatment where possible, but she understood from the beginning that the path before her would be brief. In these months, her work did not cease. She continued to speak for UNICEF, to advocate for children, even as her strength waned. She appeared before audiences thinner than before, her voice softer, yet her words carried even greater weight. For those who heard her in those final years, the urgency of her message was deepened by the knowledge that she herself was fading. She became, in a sense, a living parable, an embodiment of compassion giving itself until the very end. At home in Switzerland, in the house she had named La Paisible, the peaceful one, she sought comfort in the rhythms of ordinary days. She walked through her garden when she could, sat by the windows when she could not. White curtains fluttered in the cold winter air, and she would gaze at them for long hours, her thoughts drifting between memory and eternity. Her sons, Sean and Luca, came often to be by her side, their presence the greatest comfort she could have wished for. Robert Wolders, her companion of later years, remained with her, offering devotion unmarred by the betrayals of the past. Surrounded by those she loved, she faced the encroaching shadow with dignity. Those who visited her in those final months spoke of her serenity. Though her body grew frail, her spirit seemed untouched, luminous even as the light within her dimmed. She did not fear death, nor did she speak of it with dread. She had lived through war, through hunger, through heartbreak. She had given herself to art and to service. She had known both adoration and betrayal. Now she seemed to accept that this final passage was simply another step, another journey into mystery. Her conversations often turned not to herself, but to others, to the children still suffering in the world, to the work she hoped would continue long after her. Imagine her in those last weeks, seated by the window as snow falls outside, her frame wrapped in a shawl, her hands resting lightly in her lap. The light is pale, the room quiet save for the rustle of curtains in the wind. She looks out at the whiteness, her eyes calm, as though she sees not only the snow but something beyond it. In her stillness there is no bitterness, no regret, only the quiet presence of one who has accepted the fullness of life, both its beauty and its sorrow. In January of 1993, Audrey Hepburn passed away in her home, her family by her side. The news spread swiftly across the world, and though she had long since withdrawn from the screen, the grief was immense. Millions mourned her, not only as the star who had graced cinema with unforgettable roles, but as the woman who had devoted her later years to compassion. Tributes poured in, not only from Hollywood but from UNICEF, from those whose lives she had touched in distant lands. She was remembered not merely for her beauty, but for her kindness, her humility, her quiet service. Her funeral was held in the small village of Toloche-Nas, Switzerland, where she had lived in seclusion. The service was simple, attended by family, friends, and colleagues, but also by those who had come to honor a life that had given so much. Gregory Peck, her dear friend, read a poem in her memory, his voice breaking with emotion. The village church, modest and unadorned, became that day a sanctuary for the world's grief, a place where myth and memory merged. And so, the white curtains fluttering in the winter light became the final image of her earthly life, fragile, luminous, moved by forces unseen. The angel of elegance, the child of war, the mother, the lover, the humanitarian. She departed as quietly as she had lived, her presence lingering in silence long after her body was gone. From those fluttering curtains we move now into the stillness that follows death, into the final chapter of her story, where memory becomes legacy, and the footsteps she left upon the earth fade gently into eternity, leaving behind questions of who she truly was, an angel, a myth, or simply a woman who carried unbearable sorrows with grace. The white curtains fluttered gently in the winter light, their motion soft as breath, and from that fragile image we step into her final months, when silence became her companion and love gathered close around her. Switzerland, the land she had chosen for peace, became also the place of her farewell. In the village of Tolochanas, far from the bustle of Hollywood and the ceaseless demands of fame, Audrey entered her last season, embraced not by the lights of cinema, but by the quiet devotion of family, of Robert Wolders, of her sons Sean and Luca, and of the few dear friends who were allowed into her sanctuary. Her illness, once revealed, moved swiftly, yet she bore it with the same composure that had marked her all her life. She did not rage against it, nor did she hide in fear. Instead, she seemed to accept the nearness of death as one accepts the onset of evening, inevitable and unarguable, yet filled with its own quiet beauty. Those around her often remarked upon her serenity, the way she continued to smile even as her body weakened, the way her concern remained always for others rather than for herself. Even in pain, she asked after the well-being of those who visited her, making them tea if she had strength, or whispering gratitude if she did not. Her home, La Paisible, became a place of vigil. Its gardens lay quiet under snow, its rooms filled with subdued light. She spent long hours seated by windows, looking out at the bare trees, the mountains in the distance, the horizon softened by mist. She welcomed her sons with tenderness, treasuring every moment with them, guiding them not with grand speeches, but with small gestures, quiet words, the example of her calm. She wished above all to leave them with a memory not of suffering, but of dignity, not of fear, but of gentleness. Robert Wolders remained by her side with steadfast devotion. Their companionship, formed after so many disappointments, proved to be the love she had sought all her life. Quiet, loyal, nurturing. He tended to her with care, walked with her when she was able, sat with her in silence when she was not. To those who saw them together in those final months, there was no doubt that she had, at last, found the companionship she had always longed for, though time allowed her only a few short years to enjoy it. In Robert's presence, she felt cherished, and in that cherishing, she discovered a measure of healing even as her body declined. Friends came to visit, among them Gregory Peck, who had walked beside her since the days of Roman holiday. His affection for her had endured decades, and in these final visits it deepened into grief. Others, too, came quietly, not to intrude but to honor, to sit with her in her stillness, to hold her hand, to remember together the life she had lived. These visits were not filled with grand conversations, but with silences heavy with unspoken love, with tears withheld out of respect for her composure. The nights grew longer, the days shorter. She slept more, spoke less, yet her eyes retained their light, that strange, luminous gaze that had captivated the world. Even in frailty, she radiated grace, her presence calming those around her. Nurses who tended to her remarked upon her humility, her lack of complaint, her gratitude for even the smallest kindness. She had lived her life as an icon, yet she died as a woman, ordinary in her humanity, extraordinary in her gentleness. Imagine her in those final days, lying in her bed with snow drifting beyond the window. A candle burns on the table beside her, its flame steady and low. Her sons sit nearby, one reading softly, the other holding her hand. Robert adjusts the blanket, smoothing it over her shoulders. The room is quiet, save for the faint rustle of curtains and the sound of her breathing. She opens her eyes, looks at each of them in turn, and though her words are few, the love in her gaze speaks everything. On January 20th, 1993, Audrey Hepburn's life came to its end. She was 63 years old. The world that had adored her felt the loss deeply, though she herself seemed ready. Her departure marked not by struggle, but by release. News spread swiftly, and across continents people mourned her, not only as a star, but as a symbol of grace, of compassion, of beauty both inner and outer. Tributes flowed from filmmakers, actors, humanitarians, and ordinary admirers who felt that in her they had glimpsed something rare and true. Her funeral was held in the small church of Tolochenaz. The service was simple, in keeping with her life, but the grief it carried was immense. Family, friends, and neighbors gathered, while around the world millions watched from afar. Gregory Peck, her dear friend, read a poem through tears, his voice breaking as he honored her memory. The village church, modest and unadorned, became on that day a vessel for the grief of the world, a sanctuary where silence held more weight than words. She was laid to rest in the village cemetery, a place of quiet earth and shadowed trees. Her grave was marked not by grandeur, but by simplicity, as she would have wished. Flowers were laid upon it, and in the days that followed, strangers came to leave their own offerings, drawn not by spectacle, but by reverence. The mountains stood eternal in the distance, the snow blanketing the ground in white, as though to remind all who came that her search for peace had at last been fulfilled. And so her final months in Switzerland were not defined by despair, but by love. They were filled with the presence of those who mattered most, with the dignity of acceptance, with the serenity of one who had lived fully and now released herself fully. She'd been a child of war, a dancer thwarted, a star adored, a lover betrayed, a mother devoted, a humanitarian tireless. And now she became simply a woman who passed gently into silence, leaving behind a memory that would outlast her body, a legacy that would endure in films, in photographs, in the work she had championed, and in the countless hearts she had touched. The image that closes this chapter is of a single candle burning at dusk, its flame reflected in the window beside her bed. Outside, the snow falls silently, the sky darkens, and the world prepares for night. Inside, the flame flickers softly, steady, until the end. From that candle, we move now into the last part of her story, where we reflect not upon the sorrows alone, nor upon the scandals, but upon the legacy she left behind, an ambiguity between angel and woman, myth and reality, footsteps fading into eternity. The candle burned at dusk, its flame reflected faintly in the window beside her bed, steady against the encroaching dark. Outside, the snow descended in silence, softening the world into a whiteness that seemed almost to cradle it. From that flame, from that silence, we move into the final reflection on Audrey's life. Not the recounting of events alone, nor the tallying of triumphs and sorrows, but the meditation on what remains after footsteps fade, after the body is laid into the earth, after the applause has long since stilled. What, then, is her legacy? Was she the angel the world imagined, or was she something more fragile and more human? A woman who bore unbearable sorrows with grace, whose light shone not because it was untouched by darkness, but because it was shaped by it. Audrey Hepburn's legacy cannot be reduced to the films alone, though they remain luminous. Roman Holiday, Sabrina, Funny Face, Breakfast at Tiffany's, My Fair Lady, Charade, The Nun's Story, and others. Each captured a fragment of her. Each preserved her image in the world's imagination. Yet these roles, beloved as they are but one layer of her truth. The world saw her as the face of elegance, as the muse of Givenchy, as the embodiment of a certain ideal of feminine grace. But behind the pearls and gowns was always the child of war, the girl who had eaten tulip bulbs to survive, who had carried resistance messages in the soles of her shoes, whose body had been carved by hunger into fragility. That child never vanished. She lived within every glance, every gesture, every silence Audrey gave to the camera. Her legacy also lies in her humanitarian work. In her final years, she became the voice of those who had none, carrying the memory of her own hunger into the parched fields of Africa, into refugee camps where despair threatened to consume. She used her fame not for herself, but for others, transforming her myth into a vessel for compassion. And in doing so, she offered a rare example, that beauty and grace are not diminished by service, but deepened by it. For many, she remains not only the actress of unforgettable roles, but the advocate who held starving children in her arms and called the world to action. But beyond films and humanitarianism, her legacy endures in the ambiguity of her image. The world called her an angel, yet she was also a woman of flesh and longing. She was fragile, vulnerable to love's betrayals, marked by miscarriages, illnesses, and disappointments. She was loyal even when loyalty wounded her, forgiving even when forgiveness left her unprotected. She stumbled, faltered, wept in silence. And yet, in her very fragility, she revealed a strength that was unlike the strength of others. For her strength was not in domination, nor in defiance, but in endurance, in carrying sorrow without bitterness, in continuing to believe in tenderness even after betrayal. Perhaps this is why she endures so powerfully in memory. For she was never merely perfect. She was human, and her humanity made her beauty more piercing. She embodied the paradox that one may be both broken and luminous, both sorrowful and radiant, both ordinary in suffering and extraordinary in grace. The world saw an angel, but perhaps what it loved most deeply was the woman behind the angel, the one who bore her wounds quietly, who never surrendered to despair, who carried herself with dignity no matter how heavy the burden. Imagine her footsteps now fading across time. They echo first through the streets of Arnhem, a child slipping quietly past soldiers with messages hidden in her shoes. They echo through the rehearsal halls of London, where ballet dreams were abandoned, not through lack of will, but through the frailty imposed by hunger. They echo through the piazzas of Rome, where a young woman stood in the sunlight, suddenly crowned by fame she had not sought. They echo down Fifth Avenue, where she gazed into Tiffany's window, pearls around her neck, loneliness in her heart. They echo through stages of marriage and motherhood, of loss and betrayal, of quiet joy in her sons. They echo in distant villages where starving children reached for her hands. And finally, they echo through the snowy paths of Tolochanas, where her steps slowed, faltered, and ceased. Yet even as her footsteps fade, her presence remains. Her films still flicker on screens, her image still graces walls, her humanitarian legacy continues through UNICEF. But perhaps her truest legacy is less tangible, the way she made people feel. To watch her is to be reminded that beauty can be gentle, that dignity can be quiet, that grace can coexist with sorrow. To remember her is to sense that even in the darkest times, it is possible to move with tenderness, to endure without bitterness, to give without demanding in return. And so we returned to the candle at dusk, burning steady in the window. Outside, the snow falls silently. Inside, her family gathers, their love surrounding her. The flame trembles, flickers, and at last goes out. Yet in the darkness that follows, one realizes that its light has not vanished entirely. It lingers in memory, in the eyes of those who loved her, in the films that captured her, in the children she helped, in the countless hearts she touched. Was she an angel? Perhaps not, for angels are without wounds. She was something rarer, a woman who carried her wounds with such grace that the world mistook her for an angel, and thus her story does not end in silence alone, but in the footsteps that fade into eternity, leaving behind the faintest echo, a question without answer. Was she truly the angel we believed, or was she simply one of us, bearing sorrow as we do, but with a dignity that turns suffering into light?